These are the two Surrogator halves that we're going to put together, and it's actually pretty simple. There's a little lip right there that connects underneath that piece of metal, and then there's a small latch down there at the bottom, and it connects over to this latch piece right here. So, you know, 2 clips at the top and then 2 latches at the bottom. You're set to go. I also put zip ties on the clamps at the bottom so that they stay clamped. Okay, Surrogator pieces, or the 2 halves, are connected together. We got the brooding end, which is insulated, and they'll be locked down in that for the first week with this little latch. It's controlled by a lever right here, and I'll drop it down so you can see. So they're going to be locked in that first week, and the latches that hold the 2 parts together need to be zip tied because we don't want any unpleasant surprises. Now that Surrogator's together, the next step is to put the water barrel on top. One of the things that I did was I drilled out that little hole to make it easier for the real thin water line to go through. The other thing I did too was that I coon-proofed that water level tube that he has there. Never had any problems with it, but you know, we got a lot of coons around here, and if they chewed through it, then water would leak out. So. And then the last thing I do is that I use an excess of bungee cords to strap the water barrel on. Make sure that, again, the coons don't knock it over. The tube that comes out of the water barrel comes straight out of the bottom. You can see I've strapped it down with my bungee cord rig. Comes straight out down into the top of the Surrogator and runs through a hole in the divider, and then it's going to connect over here to the water nipple. They recommend that you use vinegar to keep algae from growing in the water tank. It's a good thing to have in your quail supplies. I use 3 capfuls. I doubt that they like sour water, but 3 capfuls, and I've never had any problems. There's any number of different ways to load water into it. I've done everything from a 55-gallon drum with a hose on it, and the thing that I find easiest is 2 5-gallon buckets from Home Depot. And you know, as you've seen before, I bring water out every time and top it off with 5 to 10 gallons worth of water every time. I'd rather have too much than not enough. Well, it looks like the water barrel's about half full out of 2 5-gallon buckets. It's a 15-gallon water tank, but I don't fill the buckets all the way full. The next step is to adjust the height of the waterer and make sure that you bleed it. And the way that you bleed it is simply by opening this little valve right down here and letting all the air flow out until it flows clean, and then close it, and then make sure that the waters, when they touch them, they work okay. And they look like they work fine. You can hear the heater going now. The next step is to hook up the heating unit, and I do remember that when I got the heating unit, that little mounting hole wasn't quite big enough, and so that was a little bit of a disappointment, but I was fortunate that I had actually set the Surrogator up in the barnyard and test ran it for a week or 2 first, so I could work out all the kinks. You might want to double check that. I'm sure he's probably improved it by now, but just double check that the heating unit mounts okay on that little post. The hose runs back through the divider and then up and out the top into the regulator, and if you paid attention in week 3 or week 4, you needed to refill your propane bottle. The heating unit does have an igniter on it. For some reason I've never gotten it to work, so I use one of the gas grill lighters that you can get for about $2.50, and that certainly makes lighting the pilot light a whole lot easier. The instructions call for you to start with to provide the quail chicks with 3 weeks of heat. These quail chicks are 5 days old, and given the Texas heat and the fact that I lost 25 in 1 week in the last cycle, instead of starting them on 5, I'm going to start it on 3, which is a thermostat setting, for a week. Then I'm going to run it on 1 for a week, then I'm going to take the heat out. Rather than running it on 5 for a week, and then 3 for a week, and then 1 for a week. So we're just going to dial the cycle back by 1 week. Again, highly recommend, you know, one of these inexpensive gas grill lighters. I usually have to hold the flame onto the pilot for 30 to 45 seconds before it starts working. So I don't understand how the igniter would ever work. They're $2.50, and put it in your Quail bucket and you won't regret it. The last piece of the heating system is this ceramic heat disperser. They recommend that you take it out of the Surrogator after you turn off the heat. In fact, they recommend that you take the entire heating unit out. I don't. I guess the Quail chicks could peck at it, but I've never had a problem. That's the same one that I've been using from the very beginning. But that said, I do have a spare back in the barn so that if something ever did happen to it, I could replace it quickly and easily. The next step is to mount the gravity feeder, the feed trough. It just hangs right on the end and holds exactly 50 pounds of feed. A word about feed. Depending on where you buy your birds, I actually buy my first sack of feed from the guy who I buy the birds from. Number one, it's easy, and number two, it's the same feed that they've been eating already for 5 days. So it seems to serve them well. If that's an option for you, I highly recommend it. I personally think that the feeder in this thing is perfectly designed. It holds exactly 50 pounds of feed. That said, if you start with week-old birds or 5-day-old birds, be prepared with another 20-pound sack, because they're going to eat more than 50 pounds over a 5-week cycle. The next step is installing the fly-out preventers, or the fly-out shields. And I left one of them off, and we're going to load the chicks. Time to load the Quail chicks. I get there's 125 Quail chicks in that, and we'll load them into the Surrogator. They're ready to go. One of the things that the Surrogator people recommend is using a paper plate with food on it so that they can get to it easily. I've done that, and they actually sell a little chick starter, some green jello protein stuff that the birds appear to like. I don't use that anymore, and instead of using a paper plate, because I've got this feeder trainer, I went ahead and scattered feed on that, and as soon as they settle down, they'll come find it. Pretty typical behavior for putting the baby quail in. They're going to all go to that corner for some reason. It's always that corner, and they're going to try and smother up on each other. You can see why it's important that you provide heat for them, because if you don't provide heat for them, the ones on the bottom will get smothered. But with the heat starting to circulate a little bit and the top on, they are starting to branch out a little bit, and they'll find the food very shortly, and they'll be off and rolling. You see some finding the food already over there. Okay, well, the Quail are locked and loaded. New Surrogator location. We scouted it out 2 weeks ago. We cleaned it up a week ago, and with the help of my dad today, loaded it up. Got 122 5-day-old Quail chicks in there. Ordered 125 and then found 3 dead ones. Generally speaking, I don't find any dead ones, but who knows? You know, they're 5 days old and they're pretty fragile birds. One of the critical pieces is to get your Surrogator aligned with the wind. In this particular situation, the wind's coming generally from this direction, and we want the brooding into the Surrogator upwind so that it protects the pilot light on the heating unit, so that that doesn't blow out and that the chicks don't clump up and smother. So this is the end of week 1 in the Surrogator, and a couple of things I want to cover this week. So number one, always bring water. It just doesn't make sense. A little bit of investment in making sure that the water tank is full will always protect you in case something happens to your water system and it drains out. Talk a little bit in detail about my Quail bucket, but it's kind of the most often needed set of supplies. We're going to double check the feed this week, and we're going to lower the temperature and release them out of the brooding end into the loafing end. My hinge broke off on the Surrogator, so I use this big handy cinder block to keep a weight on top of it, and I actually have had dogs come up and mess with it. You see I also need to do a little bit of repair on the hinge there. The heads pop off. I have some extra screws and all, but those screws are broken off, so I think I'm going to put a heavier set of hinges on the Surrogator overall. It's a little bit of a weak point, but not a bad one, and the combination of a good Surrogator, it's a great product, and cinder block here and there certainly makes a difference. As you see, the divider is still down, and this keeps them confined into the brooding end for the first week, and so we're going to raise the divider and let them out into the loafing end. The other thing that needs to be done every week is you need to adjust the height of the watering nipple so that it's at eye height for the birds. Where are they? I hear them over there. You see a couple of dead ones. And so that's adjusting it is pretty simple. I like to adjust the height of it. I like to see that they've come up to it, and then use that adjustment knob right there to adjust the height of it. They're still pretty small, so I doubt that they're going to need a whole lot of height adjustment this week. And the other thing that I'm still working with is the prototype feeder, and you can see it sitting over there, trying to train them to come to the tall white thing for food, and looks like they're starting to recognize some of it. So every week you're going to have to do some cleaning out of the dead baby quail. Some just aren't going to make it, and that's just the laws of nature, I guess. We have, with those 3 down there, we have 8 dead this week out of the load. Here's the heat adjustment, and as you can see, the first week we set it on 3. If you start with day-old birds, you should start with 5, setting number 5, but we started with 5 day-old birds, and because of the heat here in the Texas summer, we started setting number 3. So you simply dial it back to a 1, which lowers the thermostat temperature, and make sure that things are still running. And I don't know if you can hear it, but the gas is still running and still creating heat for the chicks. They didn't appear to eat a whole lot of feed this week, but that's not uncommon for week-old chicks. This is week 2 of end of week 2 at cycle 2. I just came up with the idea of videotaping this to see if we could get something out of it and share it with folks. But anyway, this is week 2 of cycle 2. The birds have been in here for 2 weeks. They were approximately 5 days old when I bought them, and so they've been in here for 2 weeks. Going to do the regular week 2 cycle maintenance. It's pretty straightforward. I've learned that bringing a 5-gallon bucket of water every week is a good insurance policy, particularly as hot and dry as it's been here. Be careful that they have plenty of water. Quail don't generally drink standing water. It's kind of their last choice. Their first choice is metabolic water, which comes from the seeds and bugs and stuff that they eat. Their second choice is dew, or the water that lands on the plants, or that's available in the morning. Again, as a kind of a little water droplets. Their last choice is actually coming and drinking water from someplace. But since they're in the Surrogator and they're being fed growth and plumage starter, there's no water in that, and so we got to make sure that they got plenty of water. And I've hardened this as much as I can against the coons, but I'm always nervous that they're not going to get enough water, and that would cause a pretty bad die-off. I've been real fortunate. I ran 4 cycles last year, and this is my 2nd cycle this year, so I'm on number 6, and haven't had ever run out of water. That's why I started bringing a 5-gallon bucket in. Never run out of water, and never had a big die-off. Very fortunate. There's another one calling from over in the bushes. not sure if you can hear them in the background, but those are birds that were released last year that have survived. I'll talk in detail on another video about what I think happened from last year. The other thing, and I'll cover in more detail on another video, is in my quail bucket. And it has everything that I need to take care of business out here really easily. At this point in the cycle, they go peeping. I like a big old cinder block on top. This thing used to have a latch on it, just kind of a sliding latch. That broke off. In general, I can't say enough good things about the Surrogator, but it's going to suffer some wear and tear over time, and there's coons and all kinds of other stuff that come and visit this thing, so this big old heavy cinder block on top of this one panel seems to make a difference. Open it up. What I'm doing here is regular cycle maintenance, and it's pretty simple at week 2. Get you a paint scraper, spatula, joint knife, Home Depot, because you got to scrape the dead ones out of here, and they're kind of nasty, so it helps not to have to touch them with your hand. I also take this joint knife and I clean the inside tray of the feeder. I'm not sure why, but they all tend to eat from this one end, but I always want to just make sure that, that the feed trough is clear and not boogered up somehow. Looks okay. And make sure they got plenty of feed. They don't eat a whole lot as little chicks. This thing holds 50 pounds, and they'll start drawing it down pretty good here in the next week or so. The other part of this week is to turn the heat down. Given that they're all dead on this end, and they were 5 days old, so I'm going to change the heat setting from 3 to 1. Which says the end of week 2. Check the water level, adjust the height. That's an important part too. It's easy to forget. Is that the water nipples, the watering system and the watering nipples in here are adjustable, and they do need to be at the eyeball height of these birds. I always tap on the water nipples to make sure they're low. Now that end of the Surrogator has flight protectors on it, so if you keep the bird from flying out, you can slide these little screens around. This end doesn't, so you want to be careful when you open this up. They usually don't die on this end, so you usually don't have a problem. 5 more here, 24 dead birds, which is very uncommon. You get 2 or 3 or 4 a time. Well, I took a whopping this time. Handy tool for scraping dead quail. Variety of other goodies that you guys in here. Handy wipes also help dead quail. So this one's a good location because it's got lots of quail houses around it. You can see immediately when we release them, they're going to be protected pretty much all the way around. The location where we set the Surrogator is underneath a big shade tree, which keeps them relatively shielded from the sun. You can see that the habitat and the grasses around here are good quail grasses. They're not too thick to get around in, which is the problem on some parts of the ranch. It's a good stand of Texas bunch grasses. We call this little blue stem. It's really good grass. My mom and dad have been clearing cedars out here for a long time, and so we got all these wonderful little quail houses, and of course we got a deer blind that's blown over. And they got this nice stand of oak and cedar, and I used this site here last year and had really good success with it. Early in the morning, late in the evening, boy, you can really hear the birds come alive up in that big thick cedar brake up there. So this is a really good habitat spot. And one of the things that I've learned is you kind of need to look for two things when you're selecting a spot. So the first thing is there a shade tree that you can put it underneath to protect them from the heat of the day? But the second thing is it in an area that's relatively good quail habitat? And this is good quail habitat here. They can move. They're running birds more than they are flying birds, and they need to be able to get around. So it's the third week in the cycle, and it's time to scout out the next location, and I think I'm going to find a new one and clear a new one this time. Location scouting is a little bit art, a little bit science. The science part of it is you want a place where the trees are going to shade the surrogator during the heat of the day. And this looks like a nice location. If we cleared the brush back in there a little bit, it'd probably be good. The second part of it is quail habitat nearby. Of the 4 releases last year, I had 2 in good habitat locations and the birds did well. I had 2 in bad habitat locations, didn't pay enough attention to the thickness of the grass around there, and I don't think it had a really good survival rate over the long term, but the birds may have moved off to another location. So this generally looks like a good candidate spot. You have a little bit of clearing work to get in and do with some nippers in there. And that's another aspect of it. You've got to be reasonably easy for you to get to on a weekly basis and tend the birds. And it doesn't need to be hidden or anything like that, because it's pretty much predator. The surrogator is pretty much predator proof. So this has got a lot of nice little quail houses around here. But we'll take a look at a couple of locations and see. It's looking back on this side of it, it's pretty wide open, so that might not be so good. The places where I've had the most success is that the birds were relatively close to being able to get into thick tree cover. If they get out here, we got hawks around here, so they don't like the open skies very much at all. And so this is kind of an isolated little mott, and may not be the best location. So we'll take a look at a couple more places. That one may be one there, but again, it's a little bit closer to the trees in the background, and we'll look at it from the other side and make sure that the habitat around there, the grass cover mainly, is mostly bunch grass that they can get around on the ground. There's another couple of candidate locations here, and looking around, we got good bunch grass cover. No great big trees, but we got some small shade trees that we can clear out a spot underneath it. What you see right there in the background is the cedar and oak thicket that I was talking about previously. We're just on the other side of it. That might be a good location there. Quite a little bit of clearing out. You look around, some of these places the trees are too small. And it follows the general rule of, there's a quail house within a softball throw, and I'll talk about that at another time. But kind of 2 general rules of thumb. One of them is you can easily roll a softball through here, and you could see that you could roll a softball through here. So that means that the birds could get around relatively easily, and that you could throw a softball from one quail house to the next quail house. And as you can see, there's plenty of quail houses around here. We're still scouting and taking a look, though. Once again, it's got to be relatively easy to get to. And one of the things that I found is if it's relatively close to a road, man, it sure makes getting the mule and the equipment in and out on a weekly basis a whole lot easier. And in the event that you got to come out, I tend the birds on a Saturday night or Saturday morning. But sometimes you got stuff going on the weekend, so if you got to run out here on a Thursday night and do it in the dark, it certainly helps if it's reasonably close to a road so that you can get to it and see what you're doing. This is another candidate location. Good agarita bushes. The quail like that. They're clear underneath and they're thorny on top, and that helps protect them. Lots of quail houses in and around here. You know, there's any number of different spots we could put a surrogator. Limbs are a little bit low on that tree. You know, be a lot of head bumping. I think we could get into there and clear that out a little bit and make a nice spot. It's the Texas Hill Country, so there's not any perfectly flat places, but you know, it's clear enough underneath. There's a good candidate over there underneath that big old tree. The external habitat, or the habitat outside of underneath the tree, looks pretty good. It's reasonably close over there in the background to some oak mottes. They don't have to go very far, and they can really hide good down underneath any of these trees around here. Looks to be a pretty good general area. Grass is a little bit thick here. This is some of that King Ranch blue stem that we're trying to get rid of. You see in some places we got some native grasses trying to come up. Sure would like to kill it off, but generally speaking, you walk through here and it clears out a little bit. Nice bunch grasses. So the quail are going to nest up in these sections of these bunch grasses, and so you know, you got to consider that. Number one, when they're young birds in release, they need a place that they can take cover from predators and feed themselves reasonably well. And they eat seeds off the ground. They dig around and poke around and eat seeds that fall from the natural plants. So they need to be able to get out into the dirt areas and find where the seeds are. We hadn't had any rain this year, so you know, it's real tough to have any seeds at all. Then when it comes nest laying time, they need a nesting area, and they're going to use these bunch grasses to nest up and hide their nest right down inside those bunches of grass. And so we need good nesting cover for them reasonably close. And then when the babies are born and the bumblebees come out, the little bitty quail, they're going to have to be able to get around. And if you can imagine, you know, life, if you're 1 inch tall in this area here, it's a pretty brutal life. So, you know, you want to provide a reasonably good location for them to, number one, grow up, number two, build a nest, and then number three, raise their babies so that hopefully some of them will survive. So this generally looks like a pretty good location. That's got more clearing than I want to do. I didn't bring a chainsaw, I brought nippers. It kind of has an influence on my site selection, and makes me look for places. Now, as I walk inside this motte back towards the mule, you know, it starts looking pretty nice. So it's 11:15 in the morning, sun's up, and relatively flat ground. I imagine here's one, it's almost all cleared already. Boy, when I find those, that's just kind of magic. So I can take nippers in here and clean up the low-lying stuff. There's a nice breeze through here. Interestingly enough, the predominant breezes this year have been from the south, and the reason that's important is when you set up the surrogator, and I'll cover this in more detail during the setup, but when you set it up, you want to make sure that the brooding end is to the prevailing wind so that it doesn't blow out the pilot light on the heating unit. Otherwise, they'll all pile up on top of each other and suffocate. So this year it's been out of the south, and so there's pretty good brush protection, and yet, you know, a nice breeze through here. So I think we may have found it. It's got a little bit of a slope to it, nothing too bad. So I'm gonna work a little bit and clear out the agarita so we don't get all clawed up every time that we walk in here to tend the birds. It's week 3, and we got a couple of more dead ones in there. Interesting that I very seldom find any dead ones over down there in the loafing end. They're almost always in the brooding end. And one of the things you want to do every week is adjust the height of the watering nipple so that it is exactly the height of their eyes. And you can see they've grown quite a bit in the last week. So we're going to adjust the height of the watering pipe up a little bit so that they can drink easily. The way that you adjust it is loosen it here. And I like to do it right as the birds are walking around, and then tighten it again. You see that's about the right height. The other thing I like to do every week is just touch it with my finger to make sure that it's feeding okay, and looks like all those nipples are going to feed okay this week. Lots of little birdies in there. It almost always happens this way. Every week that I check it, they tend to eat out of one end and not the other end. You know, and it's been that same way every week for every Surrogator cycle that I've ever run. I don't know why, but it certainly makes it worthwhile to come out here once a week and redistribute the food. I'll do a little before and after. I've selected this site. It's week number 3, and I've selected this site as the best location for the reasons that I talked about earlier. I'm going to take some, it's nice, and I don't need a chainsaw to clear it or anything like that. I'm going to take some nippers and get in here and trim the brush back so that it's easy to get to. I have friends and family come see the operation and help me sometime and that kind of stuff, and I want it to be comfortable for them. I brought a little rake, and I'll rake some of the leaves back and find kind of the exact spot where I want to sit it, and we'll be back after I've done a little manual labor. So this is the after picture of having cleared it out. Number one, I want to make really clear that I'm standing on the shoulders of greatness, because there was a big old cedar tree right here and a bunch of other brush at one point in time, and it would not be this easy to find and clear these places if my mom and dad hadn't been coming out here for many years clearing out the cedars, which are kind of anathema here in the Texas Hill Country. So definitely standing on the shoulders of greatness there. So you can see it cleared it out. Got plenty of room to work. The wildlife management people say you ought to rake it down to bare dirt. You know, good luck here in the hill country, man, because you're gonna go through 4 or 5 inches of dead, rotten leaves, and I really haven't found it a problem to set it right on top of the leaf litter underneath the trees. Just haven't found it to be a problem at all. I got a nice spot, got a nice cool breeze, got some shade, reasonably close to a road, and all it took was nippers and a rake, because my mother and father had been here and built up these 3 big old giant piles of cedar trees at some year past. So thanks, Mom and Dad. We're going to do a quick check from the location that we cleared last week, and at the end of week 3, this is the end of week 4, and so at the end of week 3 we did some scouting for new locations and found one that looked pretty good, and this is the habitat around it, and I'll go over that in a minute. But it spent an hour or so finding the right location, and then clearing out the brush so that the Surrogator would fit in there and it's easy to get to. And I just wanted to double check this week that everything looked good. You can see that there's some big old brush piles here. They're not ideal quail habitat, but this kind of motte of trees over here is a really good habitat for released birds. So it's clear underneath where they can get around and move, but it's got a lot of good overhead protection where they can hide from the hawks and the eagles and things like that. Likewise over in this area, so this is the area that I cleared last week, and it's looking good. You can tell we did some work in there and cleaned it out nicely. Again, you know, hats off to Mom and Dad, because Dad's the one that cut all this cedar brush, and Mom's the one that stacked it all, so it wouldn't be nearly this easy if they hadn't done that kind of work over the years. But you can see it's got relatively good shade. It's 10 o'clock in the morning and shaded pretty good. It's got some wind protection, which is going to be important so that the pilot light doesn't get blown out on the heater. When they release immediately, it's going to provide some immediate cover right around here in this thorny agarita. But the location looks good. I think we might have found another good location. Come. Sit. Stay. Hi, this is the end of week 4, and so a couple of things on the regular schedule that we want to do this week. I always bring water. I want to top the water off. It's really hot and dry this summer in Texas, and so I want to make sure that the birds are okay there. Starting with week-old birds instead of day-old birds, I always want to bring a sack of chick starter and make sure that Jill, come. Jill, come, sit. Day. Always want to make sure that they have plenty of feed. They tend to, starting with week-old birds, they tend to eat more feed than starting with day-old birds. And the last thing I want to have happen is for them to run out of feed in the last week. We're going to release them next weekend. And I got my quail bucket as usual. And this is Jill, and probably one of the, between Jill and my two daughters, really the biggest reasons that I do this. Yeah, she's ready for some quail. So we'll get on with it. That's a picture of the ceramic heat shield that I was talking about in the thermostat unit. You can see I set it on 1 last week, and now I'm going to go ahead and turn it off completely. And you see there's a, where is he? There's the chick. He's probably not going to make it. He looks pretty poor. But when you turn off the internal heating unit, one of the things that they recommend is that you take this out. You take the whole unit out, but you specifically take this out because the birds tend to peck on it a little bit. Like I said, I haven't seen that problem. The other thing that I do is that I run my spatula along that food tray down there, just to make sure that the feed is pulling easy and dropping down gravity feed like it ought to. Come. Sit. Stay. Everything looked good this week. Jill, sit. Stay. Everything looked good this week. We had 3 dead birds in there. So they're old enough now that they're weathering this pretty horrible heat. The game camera showed only a little bit of activity, a little bit of hog activity, a little bit of coon activity, but nothing, you know, disturbed the surrogator or got into it. Week 4 is also usually the week that I clear my next location. So we scouted it out last week at the end of week 3. We cleared it at the end of week 4, get it all ready, like we've talked about before. However, one of the things that I'm going to try this year is concentrating my bird releases across 3 different locations. So I do 4 releases a year, and I have 3. This is a new location, but I have 2 good known locations that when I release them, Jill, come, sit. And it's tough to work against genetics. Stay. I have 2 good locations that I've used previously. The birds do well there, and it's really good habitat. It's really good habitat so that they seem to thrive well after release. So I'm going to continue using those 2 locations in rotation. Hopefully this will be the 3rd good location. You know, you can guess about the habitat, but you don't really know until you release the birds and see what they do. Hush, hush. So hopefully this will be another 3rd location. If I can have 3, maybe 4 really good locations, I don't mind concentrating the places that I release the birds, because they're going to, you know, all the research says that they're going to move out and spread out as they need to, and that saves me the trouble of always having to clear locations, unless I want to move to an entirely different section of the ranch and start propagating birds in that area. Again, it's always risky, and it's habitat dependent. So you know, like I've said a bunch, the surrogator works like a charm. It's habitat that's going to help the birds to survive and thrive once they're released, and then stick around, because they're naturally going to go to the best habitat that suits the current climate, the current conditions, as well as what they're trying to do. So they're trying to pair up, are they trying to nest, are they trying to brood the babies? All those require different types of habitat. So the key that I'm finding for long-term success with a surrogator is being really, really picky about your locations, so that the birds get the best habitat right out of the box. So I'm going to reuse a habitat, a release location that I've used before. We'll come back next week. We'll release these birds, haul the thing back to the barn, power wash it all down, bring it back out, set it up. Jill. Yeah, those are her birds. Set it up and load up the babies. week number 4 in the Surrogator, and something's been busy digging out underneath the edges of the Surrogator. One of the things that I've learned, I guess this is my 6th cycle doing this. One of the things that I've learned that if you start with week-old birds instead of day-old birds is, bring some feed this week because these slightly older birds eat more than day-old birds. If you start with day-old birds, then 50 pounds of this Do More Chick Starter Grower seems to work well. It's got the right protein requirements. Like I said, when I buy the chicks from the breeder, I always make sure to get a sack of feed from him, because I think that it helps to feed them the same food that they've been on since they were hatched. So not a whole lot to do this week. Check the water. Yeah, see, that's interesting. So they're drinking quite a bit of water as well, because last week I filled this thing up and it's well below half now. So I always bring water as well. So because the thing you don't want to have happen is have them run out of food or water. Here's another caution for you. I have the Surrogator XL model, and each end of the brooding end opens up with these hinged roofs. Lids, so to speak, and they have these fly out preventers, or these sliding cages, and I highly recommend that you use those, because these little guys will fly out of there if somebody walked up from the other side. So I open one at a time and do what I need to do, and then slide it back across to make sure that they don't fly out, because I have lost birds before because they just flat flew out. The feed wasn't too bad this week. They didn't eat it down, and that should be plenty between now and the end. We got one more week, and that's 15 pounds of food, so I doubt that they'll eat that all, and if they do, they'll be really hungry and come back to the feeder that I set up. So. We're at the end of week number 5, so we're going to release this cycle of birds. I've lost about 30. The heat's been really bad this summer in Texas, so I think there's about 90 birds in there to release. A couple of things that I've learned prior to releasing birds. So I found it very beneficial to bring my homemade quail feeder and put it right here where I release the birds. I will load the bottom of it up with any leftover chick feed, and then I'll put scratch grains in the top. It seems to work good. I get you've seen the details, but there's a small cage around the bottom of it to keep most of the critters off of it, and then my quail callback device thus far seems to work pretty good for 3 or 4 days, and then I don't see a whole lot of quail after that. I think it's because I still haven't completely handled the coon problem, and what'll happen is that I'll get coons and deer all night long. So I think the cage keeps the deer off. The new brackets that I've put on it keeps the hogs from lifting the cage up, but I still haven't figured out a way to keep the coons out of the cage. And 2 weeks ago, they completely emptied. I think this thing holds probably 15 or 20 pounds of feed. They completely emptied me out. So I still got some experimenting to do there. Nonetheless, it's a pretty simple design. It's made out of 4-inch PVC with some holes drilled in the bottom, and it's simply hose clamped to a T-post. And so I leave these T-posts at every release spot, and that gives me an easy place to move the feeder to as I release the birds. So we'll get set up. I'm going to set up the quail feeder, and then I'll set up the cameras to film the magnificence of all the birds coming out. It's starting to cool off a little bit here in Texas. Today is the 4th of September, and here at the ranch, where it's been easily 100 degrees by 10 o'clock in the morning, it's 10:15 and about 85 degrees. So maybe we're getting a little bit of break in the Texas heat. Normally this time of year too, I would have one more cycle of birds. I went to pick up birds this morning, and my bird supplier wasn't there and unavailable via phone. So I'm not sure what happened. I got a pretty narrow window to get one more cycle of birds in. But nonetheless, we'll get these released and we'll take the Surrogator back and clean it up and go from there. All right, today's the end of week number 5 in the Surrogator, and we're going to release about 95 quail. We had one day that was a big die-off, or 1 week that was a big die-off, and lost 25 that week, but we've really only lost 5 or 6 past that. So I figure somewhere between 90 and 95 quail. Pretty straightforward. I like a lot of video cameras, so I got one sitting over here as well. One of the first things I do is get rid of the water. It just makes it easier fooling with everything, and really reach up here and move it over to the side. It's still got a lot of water left, which is good. I'm going to unplug it from the nipple waterer down here and let it start draining out. And I like to take the birds and scoot them all down to the other end. They're pretty skittish, as they should be, and if you hear me scream like a girl, it's because there's a snake underneath the Surrogator that I saw just a little bit ago. So I'll try not to scream like a girl if it pops out. Move the propane tank back out of the way. It just makes everything generally easier to fool with. Get this water draining. Get the birds all shuffled down to that end. Go on, guys. Go on. Go on. Everybody get down there. Uh-oh. There we go. Get on down there. I'm going to close this middle gate, and that makes it easier to let them out. And, they definitely had plenty of water while they were in there. Here we go. Nice. Woo! That makes it all worth it. That makes it all worth it. Yeah, there'll be a couple in there. There we go. They get all scattered out of there. Come on, guys. That was a good flight. Come on, guys. Let's go. Go on. They were absolutely ready to go. There we go. It just amazes me that they can fly, because they haven't been able to fly in there. So it always amazes me that they're able to. And there's always a couple of laggards. So we'll take a screen and scrape them on out of there. Come on. No, here we go. Go up. There we go. There we go. 3 more. Come on, get out of there. Get out of there. Come on. There we go. Got trapped in this in here. Oh, one got me. Come on, there you go. Still got one. There we go. Looks like I got one dead one in there, and that's releasing the quail. So we're going to break down the Surrogator, and so that's what a quail release looks like. A lot of hard work for 15 seconds worth of fun. You can still hear them around here. So the next step is to break down the Surrogator and load it up in the truck, take it back to the barn, power wash it, clean it really good, and we will put it in a new location. One of the things that I'm going to do as well is I'm going to put a feeder here, and I'll take the remaining feed from in the trough feeder back here, and I'll put it on the ground. You can hear all the birds are still around here, so an extra couple of days of feed right here will benefit them tremendously, and also draw them to the new quail feeder that I've been working on. It's nice to hear.